Hi and welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news about the Russo-Ukrainian war. This is the place where we cut the BS and where you learn what the media doesn't tell you. Which brings us to today's topic. The very important battle of the Siverski Donetsk. Did you ever hear about it? That's what I thought. So let's take a look at what's actually going on beyond the memes of cope cages. As always, the information changes by the hour, so if you have any new information, just comment it below. And remember, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads, so if you like the information I provide, make sure to check out my Patreon, the link is in the description. You see, the main fighting in Ukraine is taking place all along this river called the Siverski Donetsk. You can easily spot it on Google Maps. It's this fertile green forest area located on both banks of the river, which currently acts as Ukraine's main line of defense in Donbass. But you might ask, with all what we've seen in the media, how come the Russian army hasn't yet collapsed? After everything it has been through, let's talk about the evolution of the Russian army. Russian forces have adopted a sounder pattern of operational movement in eastern Ukraine. Since phase 1, the Russian army has gone through a complete reorganization. A lot of it could be attributed to General Dvornikov, which I covered in a previous video. Basically what he did is that he completely abandoned the much beloved Soviet deep battle doctrine. It just didn't work with modern weaponry and the forces currently available of the Russian army. The Russian army has also shown how it could profoundly adapt to the problem it was facing. In only a couple weeks, commanders that performed poorly were removed either by Russia or Ukraine. And despite facing defeat in northern Ukraine and at Kiev, they demonstrated great maneuvering skills during their retreats, during which they redeployed towards Donbass without the collapse of their forces or a significant drop in morale. If anything, morale is better now. They basically solved a lot of the issues related to supplies. And this renewal of the Russian army is also very visible on social media. From what the Ukrainians film, we don't see Russian prisoners anymore, or the countryside littered with tanks getting pulled by tractors, or footage of entire Russian army columns completely obliterated. The Russian advances are proceeding methodically rather than rapidly, with an increased use of artillery, either howitzers, self-propelled artillery, or multiple rocket launchers, to the extent where they don't even send in their infantry unless the defenders are basically all 10 feet under. This was the Russian response to the deadly Ukrainian anti-tank squads that kept ambushing their armored columns. Let's talk about the Battle of Kursk. No, don't worry, you're still in the right video. I'll be honest, at first, my goal was to compare the battle in Donbass with the 1943 Battle of Kursk, because at first glance they share a lot of similarities. Put simply, the Ukrainians are in a similar position as the defending Soviets at Kursk, whereas the attacking Russians take the spot of the Germans of 1943. How the tables have turned, right? As you can see on the map, both battles are physically close to one another. But not only that, they're geometrically similar. In 1943, the Soviets held a salient extending 250 kilometers from north to south and 160 kilometers from east to west into the German area of control centered on the city of Kursk. Whereas the Donbass salient extends 172 kilometers from north to south and 156 kilometers from Donetsk border to Severodonetsk, with the Ukrainian defense centered around Kramatorsk. Also very similar with the defenders at Kursk, Ukrainian forces have formed multiple lines of trenches and fortified positions to render any breakthrough of enemy forces very costly, if not impossible. The Ukrainian General Staff is also convinced they can hold the Donbass. That's why they haven't retreated. They're even doubling down, just like the Soviets did at Kursk. Basically, this is the battle where the war is gonna be settled. Another similarity is how both battles involved a northern and a southern pincer. And in both cases, one of the pincers advanced more rapidly than the other. At Kursk, it was the German southern assault that pushed deep into enemy lines, whereas in Donbass, it's the northern one that's showing more progress. like an inverted Kursk. But that's about where similarities between the two battles end. The battles are in fact very different. I see you guys coming. The army sizes are very different. So I'm not even going to talk about that. But more importantly, let's take a look at the ratio of forces. Although the Germans were attacking, they faced a defending force 2.5 times larger in personnel than their own. And for tanks, Soviets had a 2-to-1 advantage. I'm not sure the Germans would have attacked had they known these numbers. In comparison, Zelensky said on April 14th that Russia would be trying to surround a Ukrainian group of nearly 44,000 troops in Donbass. 2 weeks passed by, they received a lot of reinforcements, but they also suffered some significant casualties. So let's just keep that number at 44,000. On the 18th of April, Ukraine's general staff said Russia had concentrated 87 BTGs or battalion tactical groups, or roughly 17,000 troops, whereas the Pentagon believes it's closer to 76 BTGs or nearly 60,000 troops. So let's take the middle ground, about 65,000 Russians. In this case, the attacking Russians have a slight numerical advantage of 1.5 to 1, when in military theory, the minimum that you want is 3 to 1. This little edge that the Russians have is due to the redeployment that we mentioned earlier. This could explain why the attack on the Donbass salient that I talked about for weeks did not happen earlier, because the attacking Russians simply did not have enough troops. However, now that they received some reinforcements, we notice some more progress in their offensive, although still very slow. Some believe at this rhythm, it would take Russia 2 to 3 months to gain control of all of Donbass. Not really what we could call a blitzkrieg. Also at Kursk, it was believed that the defending Soviets had a numerical advantage in artillery of 5 to 1. But the Russians, the modern Russians, kept this Soviet and actually Imperial Russian heritage. And now it's the attacking Russians that have an overwhelming advantage in firepower. We're talking fighter jets, bombers, helicopters, but mainly artillery. And this advantage in firepower is particularly decisive in open ground and sort of cancelled in urban areas, which explains why it takes so much time. But there's something more important than this mathematical approach. Unlike the Germans in 1943, the Russians seem to have noticed that the northern and southern pincers were so far apart that they could not mutually support each other. If encircling the salient seemed like a magnificent T-bone steak, the ground to cover and Ukrainian defenses proved to be much more than what the Russians could chew. That's why the Russians probably opted for a smaller objective that nobody thought of. Because the mistake is that everyone overestimates the capabilities of the Russian army. Essentially, in the Russian plan, the eastern and southern parts are on partial standby. That means that for now their task is to keep putting pressure on Ukrainian forces, but the bulk of the attack comes from the north. It's also easier to manage since the city of Belgorod serves as an important logistical hub. It's very close to the area of operation, and essentially all supplies are sent to that one location. This is where we have to talk about the Battle of the Siverski Donetsk. I noticed something looking at Soviet offensives during World War II. They often relied on this principle where they would launch multiple simultaneous offensives at once. Obviously, not all of them would work as expected. However, the Soviet trick was that the attacks that failed would be called diversions. I think they kept the tradition going not long ago. But then the Soviets would concentrate their forces on the attack that performed the best. In Donbass, the Russians attempted 3 axes of attack, one from the north, one from the east, and one from the south. The one in the east faced the most problems. Ukraine prepared to defend the line of contact with Russian-occupied Donbass since 2014, and after 2 months, Russian troops continued to struggle to penetrate those prepared defenses, as shown by repeated Russian efforts to take Marinka, Avdiivka, or to advance through Popasna, just beyond the original line of contact. Essentially, in this area, the war turned into a positional battle like World War I, or like a more modern example, the Iran-Iraq War. with a slight touch of vodka and rye bread. Meanwhile in the south, the siege of Mariupol and the Ukrainian counterattacks at Kherson delayed any major offensive as important forces had to be kept in reserve. However, in the north, the Russians managed to break through the Siverski Donetsk river at Izum. This was really unexpected because the city had important natural defenses. Currently, instead of tackling this huge spectacular encirclement at once, the Russians prefer to munch on the salient all along the river. Now let's talk about the Battle of Izum. The most intense fighting is currently taking place south of Izum. Ukraine counterattacks to push back the Russians beyond the river have failed, repeatedly and often at the cost of high casualties. And whatever the media tells us about these counterattacks, the Russians keep pushing forward. At this location, troops witnessed hand-to-hand fighting and major tank-on-tank engagements on the road between Izum and Slavyansk. Quick question, have you ever needed pizza dough? Because this is essentially what the Russians are doing at Izum. No, don't worry, it's not a cheesy catchline to sponsor a product. But let me explain. You take the dough and then you roll over it over and over until the dough is even, like in a circle. However, what's important with the pizza is that you don't want any side to be bigger than the other. So what you do is that you roll on one side, then you roll on the other side, keep it tight. This is the same thing they're doing on the battlefield. Russian troops are pushing down multiple roughly parallel roads within supporting distance of one another, allowing them to bring more combat power to bear than their previous practice had supported. And in this area, they likely benefit from the absence of prepared Ukrainian defensive positions. In the end, it's a slow but methodical approach, where the emphasis is put on destroying enemy forces with artillery, the king of battle, rather than just taking ground. That's what they did in phase 1, and they couldn't support these attacks. Did you know that the Russians fire roughly 400,000 to 600,000 artillery shells per day, and a large portion is dedicated to the Izum offensive? No shit that Ukrainian counteroffensive don't work. They're met with a storm of steel. But you can also imagine the result on Ukrainian defenses. So yes, Ukrainian artillery is doing its best to counter the Russian counterparts, but they have much less artillery and they suffer from a lack of ammo. And by the way, the 190,000 artillery shells that the US wants to send to Ukraine, this is what the Russians fire every day for breakfast. Let's talk about Ukrainian counterattacks. As compared to inflexible Russian formations, Ukrainian forces have shown great individual and tactical abilities in guerrilla-style counterattacks, most likely through NATO training. However, for bigger objectives, it seems that Ukrainian battalions have trouble launching and coordinating attacks with neighboring units, and for now are bound to remain on a defensive posture. They sent a single BTG on its own in a desperate attempt to attack Izum along the Oskol reservoir. Not only did the attack fail because they were totally unsupported, but about 1,000 Ukrainians are now encircled on 3 sides with their backs against the reservoir. Either they will surrender or they will be grinded by Russian artillery. People say 1,000 because that's a BTG, could be less, could be more. That's as many guys that were trapped in Mariupol, the 36th Marine Brigade. So let's hope that some people will actually try to get these guys out. And this shows that without proper counterattacks, holding a salient like the one in Donbass will be very difficult. Next topic, bridgeheads. Similarly to World War II Soviet doctrine, it seems to me that now the Russian objective is to create as many bridgeheads over the river as possible. And the reason is quite simple. Although they established one at Izum, all Ukrainian forces are concentrated around it. Literally, Ukrainians are sending all their reinforcements there. In any way possible, train, bus, bicycle. This makes a Russian breakthrough very difficult. This is why I believe that the Russian offensive on Liman and Yampil is so important for them. The situation is not exceptional for the Ukrainians at Liman. Ukrainian soldiers complained of high losses, constant shelling day and night, of commanders allegedly having deserted, no treatment for the wounded, low ammunition, no sleep. and despite malfunctioning weapons, soldiers were told they were forbidden to retreat. This offensive could potentially open 2 bridgeheads on the Siverski Donets. This time the bridge doesn't seem too far for the Russians. One would be right at the gate of Slaviansk, and this move could cut off supplies to Severodonetsk. And even worse, it could threaten to cut in half Ukrainian forces in Donbass and link up with forces from the east. Overall, it also acts as part of the Russian attempt to lay siege to the agglomerations of Slaviansk and Kramatorsk. Same thing at Oleksandrivka, yet another bridgehead that could threaten Ukrainian defenses around Izum. The Ukrainian right flank might be in danger and be forced to pull back, which in turn could also unlock the situation for the Russians around Izum. But this time, all the attacks can support each other. This is how they gain momentum in some sort of snowball effect. After weeks of positional battles, we could witness the crumbling of the entire Ukrainian line of defense, which could then trigger the southern front to push forward. Ukrainian forces could be stuck in multiple cauldrons like at Mariupol if no retreat is properly coordinated. If General Dvornikov manages to complete this maneuver, he can then camp and pass the ball around until the 90-minute mark. The most important factor for the Russians is the absence of large reserves that can intervene after tactical breakthroughs. As a result, many opportunities are lost for the Russians, and Ukrainian forces quickly fill the gaps while maintaining the stability of the entire defense as a whole. And because of the lack of infantry, capturing settlements will be very hard or take forever. At the same time, Ukraine went through its 3rd mobilization since the beginning of the war. Mobilized Ukrainian replacements are continuously sent to the front, thus maintaining the number of units directly involved in the fight at a fairly high combat capacity. But the quality of those replacements is iffy. For example, these 2 Ukrainian prisoners claimed that they had only 2 days of training before being sent to the front. If this is true, these replacements are literally sent into a meat grinder. At this stage of the battle, it seems to me the Ukrainians are trading men for time, desperately waiting for all the NATO weapons to reach the front. But again, you need to train personnel to use this military equipment to its full potential, especially the heavy weapons. As for Russia, some go as far as to say that without at least a partial mobilization of the country, the Donbass is the last major offensive the Russians can pull off whether they win or not, since the Russian military will be largely exhausted in terms of offensive potential. Thing is, a national mobilization would require Russian authorities to recognize that the special military operation is actually a real war. If they don't do so, Russia will be left with no replacements. Who knows, maybe Putin will announce something very special on the 9th of May during the parade. Perhaps the mobilization of the country, perhaps a declaration of war. That's all I have for you today. Let me know what you thought in the comment section below. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, if you want to support my work, you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon. The link is in the description.